The moment my father stood up at the Thanksgiving table, the room changed. 1 second, everyone was laughing about football and passing bowls of mashed potatoes, and the next second, every fork froze halfway to someone's mouth. 35 relatives sat around those long tables, pushed together in my Aunt Linda's living room, the smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon rolls still hanging in the air. My father, Richard Coleman, cleared his throat and rested both hands on the table like he was about to give a speech at church. For a second, I thought maybe he was about to say grace again or make one of his usual long toasts about family. But the look on his face told me something else was coming. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't even anger. It was certainty. "My daughter is a thief," he said. The words landed in the middle of the room like someone had dropped a glass plate on the floor. No one moved. Not my cousins, not my uncles, not even the kids sitting at the smaller folding table near the window. My mother, Carol, was already crying beside him, pressing a napkin to her eyes as if she had been waiting for this moment all afternoon. A low murmur rippled through the room, the kind people make when they don't know whether they're supposed to intervene or watch. I felt 35 pairs of eyes turn toward me at the same time. I sat there with my hands folded in my lap, listening to the quiet hum of the ceiling fan above us. My heart was beating hard enough that I could feel it in my throat, but strangely, I didn't feel shocked. Not completely. My father had spent the last few months laying the groundwork for this moment, planting small whispers in the family like seeds. I had heard the rumors already, but hearing him say it out loud, in front of everyone, was something else. "She stole money from my father before he died," he continued, his voice steady, almost calm, "and we finally have proof." Across the table, my cousin Rachel slowly lowered her glass of iced tea. My Uncle Mark leaned back in his chair like he was trying to see both of us at the same time. Someone at the far end whispered, "Oh my God." Then my father reached into the inside pocket of his blazer and pulled out a white envelope. He held it up for a moment, letting everyone see it, the way a lawyer might hold up a piece of evidence in court. The paper looked crisp and official, the edges perfectly straight. Then he walked around the table, past my aunt, past my younger cousins, until he stopped beside my chair. The entire room watched him. "This," he said loudly, placing the envelope on the table in front of me, "is a court summons." My mother's crying grew louder, shaky and theatrical. "We didn't want it to come to this," she said through tears. No one spoke. I looked down at the envelope. My name was written across the front in thick black ink, Emily Coleman. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. Most people in that room expected me to panic, to deny it, to start crying or shouting or storming out the door. My father had built an entire story around that reaction. He had spent weeks telling relatives that I had been acting strange, that guilt had made me desperate. But instead, I smiled. Not a big smile, just a small one. Because what my father didn't know, what none of them knew, was that 4 months earlier, after the rumors first started spreading, I had quietly hired someone whose entire job was tracing where money disappears. And the envelope in front of me wasn't the only one sitting at that Thanksgiving table. Under my chair, inside my bag, was another envelope, one that was much thicker, and inside it was the truth that was about to tear my father's story apart in front of everyone he had tried to convince. For a few seconds, no one in the room said anything. My father remained standing beside my chair with his arms folded, watching my face the way someone watches a suspect in an interrogation room, waiting for the exact moment they break. My mother sat next to him, pressing a napkin against her eyes as if she had been crying for hours. Around the table, chairs creaked softly as people shifted in place, unsure where to look. Some of my relatives glanced at me quickly, then looked down at their plates as if the green beans or stuffing had suddenly become very important. The tension in the room felt thick enough to touch. I was very aware of how I must have looked sitting there, 31 years old, quiet, not defending myself, not angry. Just sitting there calmly while my father accused me of stealing from my own grandfather. To most people in that room, that probably looked like guilt. I had lived in this family long enough to understand how quickly stories formed in rooms like this. Someone makes an accusation, someone else fills in the details, and before long the version everyone remembers has nothing to do with the truth anymore. In towns like ours, people didn't always wait for proof. They waited for the version that sounded the most believable. And my father had spent the last few months carefully building that version. "My name is Emily Coleman. I'm 31 years old, and I work as a registered nurse at a regional hospital about 20 minutes from where we were sitting that afternoon. Most of my shifts are 12 hours long, often overnight, the kind of work where time blurs together under fluorescent lights and the coffee machine in the break room never seems to stop running. It isn't glamorous, but it's honest work, the kind of work where people depend on you to tell the truth, even when the truth is difficult. For most of my life, I believed honesty was something my family valued too. A big part of that belief came from my grandfather, Arthur Coleman. When I was growing up, he was the one who showed up when things mattered. If my parents were busy arguing or working late, Grandpa Arthur was the one who picked me up after school. He had an old pickup truck that smelled faintly like motor oil and peppermint candy. On weekends, he sometimes took me out to a small lake outside town where he taught me how to fish. I remember sitting beside him on the wooden dock, my feet swinging over the water while he patiently untangled the knots I kept making in the fishing line. "Take your time," he would say with a quiet smile. "Rushing is how people make mistakes." Years later, when I was accepted into nursing school, he mailed me a small card with a $50 check tucked inside. The note simply said, "Proud of you, kiddo. Keep going." I kept that card for years. But about 3 years before he died, something strange happened. The phone calls stopped. At first I thought it was nothing. I would call on a Sunday afternoon and get no answer. I would leave a voicemail and assume he would call me back later. Sometimes I sent messages or small updates about work, little things about my shifts at the hospital. Nothing ever came back. Weeks turned into months, and months slowly stretched into years. I tried to convince myself that it had something to do with age, that maybe he was getting tired more easily or forgetting to check his phone. But the silence never made sense. The last real conversation we had was on the front porch of his house during a humid Georgia evening. We were drinking sweet tea, watching the sun drop behind the trees while cicadas buzzed in the distance. He had asked me about work and whether I was thinking about buying a house someday. "You're doing things the right way," he told me that night. "Just don't let anyone pull you backward." At the time, I thought he was giving me simple life advice. Sitting at that Thanksgiving table now, with 35 relatives staring at me as if I had betrayed my own family, I began to wonder if my grandfather had been warning me about something I hadn't understood yet. Across the table, my cousin Rachel finally spoke, her voice careful and uncertain. "Emily," she said softly, "is any of this true?" Rachel's question lingered in the quiet room. "Emily," she said again, more carefully this time, "is any of this true?" For a moment, no one moved. The house that had been loud with laughter and clinking dishes only minutes earlier now felt unnaturally still. I could hear the soft hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen and the faint ticking of the wall clock behind my aunt's china cabinet. 35 relatives were watching me. Some of them were people who had known me since I was a child, people who had hugged me at Christmas dinners, brought casseroles to my high school graduation party, and cheered when I told them I'd been accepted into nursing school. Now many of those same faces looked uncertain, like they were trying to decide whether the person sitting in front of them was someone they actually knew, and a few of them already seemed convinced. If there was one thing I understood about my family, it was how quickly doubt could spread when the right person planted it. My father had spent months quietly shaping the story everyone in that room believed. By the time Thanksgiving arrived, the accusation probably didn't sound shocking to them anymore. It sounded possible, but the strangest part of the entire situation was this. A year earlier, I would have said with complete certainty that none of it could ever happen. Because if there was one person in our family who had always trusted me, it was my grandfather. Arthur Coleman wasn't the kind of man who raised his voice or demanded attention. He had spent most of his life working as a mechanic, the sort of job where your hands were always stained with grease and your back ached by the end of the day. But in our family, his quiet presence carried authority. When Grandpa Arthur spoke, people listened not because he was loud, but because he was steady. Some of my clearest childhood memories came from afternoons at his house just outside town. The property wasn't fancy, just a small house with a long front porch, a gravel driveway, and a garage where he kept the tools he'd collected over decades. In the summer, the air around the place smelled like warm grass and motor oil. I spent a lot of time there growing up. Sometimes I would sit on the porch steps doing homework while he worked on an old engine in the driveway. Every once in a while he would come over, wipe his hands on a rag, and ask if I wanted a glass of lemonade or sweet tea. We didn't always talk much, but the quiet never felt uncomfortable. When I was 15, he taught me how to drive in the empty parking lot of a grocery store that had closed down years earlier. I remember gripping the steering wheel too tightly while he sat calmly in the passenger seat. "Easy," he said with a small smile. "Cars don't like being rushed, neither do people." That was how he approached most things in life, with patience and a kind of quiet certainty that made you feel safe. Which is why the last 3 years of his life had never made sense to me. After decades of regular phone calls and visits, the communication between us had suddenly stopped. I called him many times, usually on Sunday afternoons when I knew he'd be home, but the phone just rang and rang. I left voicemails that were never returned. I mailed birthday cards and Christmas cards. Once I even sent him a photo from my nursing graduation. I never heard back. At the time, I told myself it had to do with age. Maybe he was tired more often. Maybe he didn't check his phone anymore. When I asked my father about it once, he dismissed it with a shrug. "Your grandpa's slowing down," he said. "He doesn't talk much these days." I had believed him. But sitting there now, under the weight of 35 silent witnesses, a different thought crept into my mind, one I hadn't fully allowed myself to consider before. What if that silence hadn't happened naturally? What if someone had made sure my messages never reached him? Across the table, Rachel was still watching me carefully, waiting for my answer. I took a slow breath. "No," I said. My voice was calm. "It isn't true." A ripple of movement passed through the room, chairs shifting slightly as people looked from me to my father. He let out a short, dry laugh, the kind that carried more confidence than humor. "That's interesting," he said. Then he tapped the white envelope sitting on the table in front of me. "Because the evidence says otherwise." The room fell quiet again. I looked down at the envelope for a moment before lifting my eyes back to him. And while my father seemed certain he controlled the story unfolding in that room, he had no idea that months earlier I had started asking questions of my own questions about my grandfather, about his money, and about the will my father claimed had left him everything. My father tapped the white envelope with one finger, slow and deliberate, as if the sound alone could make everyone in the room believe him. "Because the evidence says otherwise," he said, and the table went even quieter than before. 35 relatives sat frozen around Aunt Linda's Thanksgiving spread, watching me as if my face might confess before my mouth did. I didn't reach for the envelope. I just looked at him, because the truth was, this story hadn't really started at Thanksgiving. It had started in March, the week my grandfather died. Arthur Coleman was 79 when he passed. "Pneumonia," the doctors said. Quick at the end, I got the call from my father in the hospital parking lot just after finishing a 12-hour shift. I was still in my scrubs, too tired to drive, when his name lit up my screen. "Grandpa's gone," he said. That was all. 2 days later, I drove 3 hours from Savannah to the funeral, gripping a paper cup of gas station coffee most of the way because I'd barely slept. The service was held in a small country church outside the town where my grandfather had lived for nearly 40 years, the kind of Southern church with white clapboard walls, polished wooden pews, and tall, narrow windows that turned the gray afternoon light soft and almost holy. Nearly everyone in the family came. My father stood at the front of the room and delivered the eulogy in a voice that cracked in all the right places. He talked about my grandfather's work ethic, his sacrifice, his devotion to family. Everything he built was for the people he loved, he said, and several relatives nodded through tears. At the time, nothing about it seemed strange. Funerals make performers out of people. Grief has a way of disguising ambition as sorrow. What stayed with me happened afterward. When the service ended, relatives gathered in the church hallway before drifting toward the parking lot. I was standing with Rachel and 2 of my aunts when my father cleared his throat and drew everyone's attention without ever raising his voice. "Before rumors start," he said, loosening his tie, "I want everybody to understand something about Dad's estate." The hallway went still. Rachel's mother frowned. "What about it?" My father answered calmly, almost casually. "Dad left everything to me." The words were simple, but they changed the air around us. "The house, the land, the savings," he continued. "That was his decision." No one challenged him. A few relatives exchanged glances, but most simply nodded, accepting it because it sounded official and because my father said it like there was nothing left to discuss. But something in my stomach tightened the moment I heard him. It wasn't the idea itself that bothered me. It was the certainty. He didn't say the will had been read. He didn't say the estate attorney explained it. He said it like a verdict, clean and final. Rachel tilted her head. Everything? That's what he wanted, my father said. I didn't argue there in the hallway. People were still carrying flowers to their cars. My grandfather's oldest friend was standing near the door with red eyes and a folded funeral program in his hand. It wasn't the place, but the thought stayed with me all the way back to Savannah. My grandfather had always believed strongly in fairness, especially when it came to family. Years earlier, sitting on his porch with a glass of sweet tea in his hand, he once told me that money could rot a family faster than anything if people weren't careful. Handle it clean, he had said. That way nobody has to wonder what was taken from them. That was why my father's announcement kept pulling at me. It didn't sound like my grandfather. It sounded like my father. Weeks passed, and nobody mentioned the will again. Life returned to its normal shape. Long shifts at the hospital, silent drives home at sunrise, leftovers in my fridge, bills on my counter. But the more I replayed that moment in the church hallway, the less it sat right with me. Finally, one evening after work, I called my father and asked as carefully as I could, "Dad, have you actually seen the will?" There was a pause on the line, brief but sharp. Then his voice turned flat. "Of course I have. Why are you asking? I just wondered whether Grandpa left anything for the rest of us." "The grandchildren." Another pause, longer this time. "Emily," he said, and now there was warning in his tone. "Your grandfather knew exactly what he was doing." He ended the conversation a minute later, but by then I had already heard what I needed to hear. If he were telling the truth, a simple question wouldn't have made him defensive. And that was the moment I decided I wasn't going to rely on his version of anything again. I was going to see the will for myself. But before I could get that far, something older kept pulling at me, something I had spent years trying to minimize because admitting what it really was would have meant admitting who my father had always been. The truth is, he had tied my future to his problems long before my grandfather died. It started 9 years earlier, when I was 22, fresh out of nursing school, working my first full-time job, and still young enough to believe that helping your parents was always the right thing to do. Back then I was sharing a small apartment with another nurse, eating cheap frozen meals between shifts, and trying to stay ahead of my student loans. One Sunday evening my father called and asked me to come over because he needed to talk to me about something important. When I arrived, both of my parents were already sitting at the kitchen table waiting for me. There was a neat stack of papers in front of my father and a box of tissues beside my mother. Even now, looking back, I can see how carefully the whole scene had been arranged. My father told me the bank was giving them trouble with the mortgage and that they only needed my help for a few months, maybe 6 at most, just long enough for him to refinance and remove my name. My mother's eyes were red before I had even sat down. "We could lose the house, Emily," she said softly, and there was something in the way she said it that made refusing feel cruel. I looked around that kitchen, at the same walls I had grown up inside, the same table where I had done homework as a teenager, and I told myself that good daughters did not let their parents lose their home, so I signed. At first I truly believed it was temporary. 6 months came and went. Then a year. Every time I asked about refinancing, my father had another explanation ready. Interest rates were bad. The lender wanted more paperwork. His credit score had dipped, but only temporarily. It was always almost fixed, always one more delay away from being handled. I wanted to believe him, so I did. By the second year, though, I started understanding what that signature had actually cost me. When my old car died in a grocery store parking lot and I tried to finance a used one, the loan officer looked at my file and quoted me an interest rate so high I thought he was joking. He wasn't. Later, when I began thinking seriously about buying a small place of my own, I learned I couldn't qualify for a mortgage at all, not with my name already attached to a home loan carrying too much debt and a history of late payments. That was how I found out my father had been missing due dates without ever telling me. The first warning came through a credit alert on my phone in the middle of the night, then another. 30 days late, 60 days late. Every time my score dropped, I called him, and every time he brushed it off as if I were being dramatic. "I handled it," he would say, meaning he had paid just enough, just late enough, with my future still tied to the damage. By the time I was 27, that one signature had done more than hurt my credit. It had delayed my entire adult life. I couldn't buy a home, couldn't get decent financing, couldn't make plans without wondering what new mess my father might create with my name attached. And whenever I pushed too hard, my mother stepped in with tears and guilt, making it sound as though protecting myself was somehow a betrayal. By the time my grandfather died, that old mortgage was still shaping nearly every financial decision I made. So a few weeks after the funeral, I sat down across from my father at that same kitchen table and said, as calmly as I could, "I need my name off that mortgage this year." He didn't look surprised. He looked insulted, as if I had broken some agreement instead of asking to be released from one. And in that moment I finally understood that to him this had never been a temporary favor. It had been an arrangement he fully expected to keep for as long as I stayed quiet. My father stared at me for a long moment after I said it, his face settling into that cold, offended stillness I had learned to fear long before I had words for it. "This year?" he repeated, as if the phrase itself were insulting. We were sitting at the same kitchen table where he had persuaded me to sign those mortgage papers 9 years earlier, only now the room felt smaller, tighter, as though every excuse he had ever made was still hanging in the air between us. My mother stood at the counter with a stack of unopened mail in front of her, pretending to sort through it even though I could tell she was listening to every word. I kept my voice even. "Yes, this year. I need my name off the mortgage." My father leaned back in his chair and exhaled through his nose. "Emily, now is not the time for this." For a second I almost laughed, not because anything about it was funny, but because that sentence had been his shelter for nearly a decade. Now is not the time. After the holidays, after tax season, after things calmed down, there was always another delay, another excuse dressed up as reason. "It's been 9 years," I said. "There's never going to be a time that works for you." My mother turned then, pressing one hand to her chest as if my tone had wounded her. "Your father just buried his dad," she said softly. "Can't you show a little compassion?" I looked at her and felt that old, familiar guilt rise in me, the instinct to back down before anyone could accuse me of being cruel. That had always been the pattern in our family. My father pushed, my mother cried, and I retreated. But something in me had hardened after the funeral. Maybe it was hearing him claim my grandfather's entire estate with that smooth certainty in the church hallway. Maybe it was the years of damage tied to my name. Or maybe I was simply exhausted from carrying a burden that was never supposed to be mine. "This isn't about compassion," I said. "I've been attached to that mortgage for almost 10 years. I can't buy my own place. My credit takes the hit every time a payment is late. I can't keep living like this." My father's jaw tightened, and for a moment he said nothing. Then he asked, in a voice that was too calm to be safe, "So what exactly are you telling me?" "I'm telling you that you need to refinance," I said. "And if you can't, then you need to sell the house and move somewhere cheaper. I don't care how you do it. I just need my name off that loan." The silence that followed felt heavier than shouting. My mother lowered herself into the chair beside him, already blinking fast, already preparing her tears. My father didn't explode right away. He never did, when he thought injury would work better than anger. He looked at me with a kind of wounded disbelief, like I had become someone unrecognizable to him. "After everything we've done for you," he said, "this is what you choose to focus on?" I felt my fingers curl into my palms beneath the table. "What I'm choosing," I said carefully, "is to stop paying for a decision you promised would only affect me for a few months when I was 22. His expression changed then. The hurt father vanished, and something flatter, harder, took its place. "So that's how you want to talk to me?" His voice dropped lower. "Fine. Then let me tell you how this is going to sound when people hear about it. My daughter, right after her grandfather dies, decides to push her parents out of their home." I stared at him. "That's not what I said." "It won't matter," he replied. My mother started crying then, softly at first, just enough to fill the room with sorrow that didn't belong to me. "I can't believe this," she whispered. "Not now. Not after everything this family has been through." I stood up because I could feel the conversation closing around me, turning into the same trap it had always been. "I'm not trying to hurt either of you," I said, though even as I said it, I realized how many years I had spent protecting them from the consequences of their own choices. "I'm trying to protect myself." My father didn't answer. He just looked at me with that flat, unreadable expression that meant he had already moved on from the conversation itself and started planning how to use it. I left 10 minutes later. By the next afternoon, the first phone call came from my aunt, asking why I was threatening to make my parents lose their house. Then a cousin texted to say she had heard I was talking about legal action right after my grandfather's funeral. By evening, the pattern was impossible to miss. My father had taken the first real boundary I had ever set and recast it as a betrayal. In his version, I wasn't a grown woman trying to untangle herself from a 9-year financial trap. I was an ungrateful daughter trying to punish her grieving parents when they were already down. By that evening, it was obvious my father had done more than defend himself. He had gone on offense. The calls started coming in one after another, each carrying the same accusation dressed in slightly different words, as if everyone had been handed the same script and told to make it sound personal. My Aunt Diane called first, her voice careful and strained, asking why I was putting my parents under that kind of pressure so soon after my grandfather's funeral. An hour later, my cousin Melissa texted to ask if it was true I was talking about legal action. Then my Uncle Ray left a voicemail saying family problems should be handled privately, not with threats. That word stayed with me long after I heard it. Threats. I hadn't threatened anyone. I had asked to be released from a mortgage that should never have remained in my name for 9 years. But once my father began telling the story, the facts stopped mattering. He had always understood something I was only beginning to accept. If you speak first and speak with enough certainty, most people will believe your version before they ever wonder whether it is true. At first, the rumor was only about the house. I was the selfish daughter trying to force her grieving parents out onto the street. That story was ugly enough on its own, but within a few days it began to change shape. It became darker, sharper, and far more useful to him. My father started telling people that my behavior hadn't come out of nowhere, that there had been concerns about me for a while, that money had gone missing around the time my grandfather got sick. He never made the accusation directly at first. That was part of what made him so effective. He knew how to place an idea in someone else's mind and let them carry it for him. The first time I heard the new version out loud, I was leaving church on Sunday morning. A woman who had known me since childhood touched my arm near the fellowship hall and asked, with that false gentleness people use when they already think they know the answer, whether everything was all right at home. I asked her what she meant, and she hesitated just long enough to make it worse. Then she said she had heard there was some issue involving cash from my grandfather's house before he died. She said it softly, like lowering her voice made it less insulting. For a second I just stared at her. Then I said, "That never happened." She looked embarrassed, but not because she realized it was a cruel thing to repeat. She looked embarrassed because I had made her hear it clearly. After that, I started noticing it everywhere. A cousin casually asked whether I had been alone at Grandpa's house near the end. An old family friend mentioned, in the same tone people use when they pretend to be concerned, that grief can make people act in strange ways. Someone else asked whether Grandpa had ever loaned me money. None of them said thief outright. Not yet, but they didn't need to. The accusation was already doing its work. My father had found the perfect lie because it explained everything in advance. If I pushed about the mortgage, it made me look greedy. If I asked questions about Grandpa's estate, it made me look suspicious. If I challenged anything my father said about the will, all he had to do was remind people that I had already been under a cloud. That was when I understood what he was really building. This wasn't just gossip, it was a defense. If anyone ever questioned why he inherited everything, he wanted them primed to believe one thing first. Emily is desperate. Emily wants money. Emily already took what she could. The worst part was how hard it was to fight something like that. Every denial made me sound defensive. Every explanation sounded like an excuse. It felt like being dragged into a trial where the verdict had already been whispered from one relative to the next before I ever entered the room. And because our world was made up of church lunches, cousin group texts, family friends, and neighbors who confused gossip with concern, the story traveled fast. I tried to ignore it at first. I told myself people would get bored and move on. But then one of the nurses on my unit pulled me aside at work and asked if everything was okay. She said her neighbor knew someone in my family and had mentioned there was some kind of financial mess involving me, my parents, and my grandfather. Standing there under the hospital's fluorescent lights, with my badge clipped to my scrub top and a medication cart rolling past behind me, I felt something inside me go cold. It wasn't staying inside the family anymore. It was spilling into the rest of my life. That was the moment my fear hardened into something more useful. My father wasn't just trying to make me look bad, he was trying to make me impossible to believe. And if I was ever going to get out from under what he had done under the mortgage, under the lies, under whatever he was hiding in my grandfather's estate, I was going to need more than my own word. I was going to need proof. And once that thought settled into place, it changed the way I looked at everything. For days, I moved through my normal routine 12-hour shifts, bad coffee, a few hours of sleep, then back again, but under all of it, my mind kept circling the same questions. Why had my father become so defensive the moment I asked about the will? Why had he started poisoning the family against me the second I asked to be taken off the mortgage? And why did it feel like he wasn't just hiding a selfish decision, but protecting something much bigger? One night after work, too exhausted to think clearly and too angry to let it go, I opened my laptop at the kitchen table and logged into the mortgage account. I still had access from years earlier, back when my father had asked me to help keep an eye on things, which I now understood had really meant carrying responsibility without any control. At first the screen looked familiar: payment history, escrow balance, principal, the same dull numbers I had hated for years. Then I saw a line that didn't belong: a home equity draw, $55,000. I stared at it, certain for a second that I had read it wrong, but the number stayed the same. The date on the transaction was 3 months before my grandfather died. I sat back in my chair and felt something cold move through me. My father hadn't just kept my name attached to that mortgage long past the point of reason. He had used that same debt, with my name still tied to it, to pull even more money out of the house without ever telling me. $55,000. I had never signed for it knowingly, never agreed to it, never seen a cent of it. But if that debt went bad, my name would still be there when the bank came looking. Until that moment, some part of me had still wanted to believe this was ordinary family dysfunction, selfish, manipulative, ugly, but still somehow explainable. Seeing that number on the screen stripped that illusion away. This wasn't just a father taking advantage of his daughter's loyalty. This was starting to look like fraud. The next morning, running on almost no sleep and pure adrenaline, I drove to the county courthouse. The building stood in the center of town, with faded brick walls, broad concrete steps, and an American flag snapping in the wind out front. Inside, everything smelled faintly of paper, floor polish, and old air conditioning. I went straight to probate and told the woman behind the glass that I needed a copy of the estate file for Arthur Coleman. She asked my relationship to the deceased, and when I said I was his granddaughter, she gave me a polite, unreadable look, then disappeared into the back room. A few minutes later, she returned with a thin file and slid it toward me through the opening in the window. "You can review it here," she said. I took it to a wooden bench near the far wall and opened it carefully. The will was right on top, typed, notarized, dated a little over a year before my grandfather's death. It stated that all real and personal property belonging to Arthur Coleman was to pass to his son, Richard Coleman. The house, the land, the savings, everything. I read the page once, then again more slowly, but it wasn't the wording that caught me. It was the signature at the bottom. Arthur Coleman. I had seen my grandfather's handwriting all my life on birthday cards, Christmas checks, little notes folded into envelopes. His writing had a certain rhythm to it, slightly slanted, a little shaky in the last few years, but still unmistakably his. The signature on the will was close enough that most people would accept it, but I didn't. Something about it felt too deliberate, too careful, like someone had copied the shape of his name without understanding the natural movement of his hand. I took out my phone and photographed the page, then sat there with the file open on my lap while people moved quietly through the hallway behind me. My father's voice from the funeral came back to me then, calm and certain. Dad left everything to me. Looking down at that signature, I felt the first real piece of certainty settle inside me. I didn't know the whole truth yet, and I couldn't prove it yet, but I knew this much. Whatever my father had filed with the court, it did not feel like my grandfather. And if I wanted to survive what he was doing to me, instinct was not going to be enough. I was going to have to follow the money, the documents, and every lie attached to them until the story finally broke open. Once I understood that instinct was not going to save me, I stopped pretending I could unravel any of it alone. I needed someone who knew how to turn suspicion into evidence, someone who could look at numbers, documents, and signatures without the fog of family loyalty getting in the way. A few nights later, after another shift spent moving through the hospital on autopilot while my mind kept replaying dollar amounts and that shaky-looking signature at the bottom of the will, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open and searched for a forensic accountant within driving distance. That was how I found Laura Mitchell. Her office was above an old hardware store in a small town south of Savannah, and when I called, her voice was steady enough to make me trust her before I even met her. She asked a few direct questions, then told me to bring everything I had: mortgage records, probate papers, account statements, dates, names, anything that felt wrong. I took a day off work the next week and drove down with a folder so full of printouts it barely closed. Laura was in her early 60s, with silver-threaded hair pinned neatly back and the kind of calm face that made panic feel embarrassing. She listened while I told her the whole story from the beginning: the mortgage I had co-signed at 22, the late payments, the rumors my father had spread, the home equity draw for $55,000, the will that supposedly left him everything, and the signature that looked close enough to fool strangers but not me. She took notes on a yellow legal pad, only interrupting to pin down dates or ask exactly when I had discovered something. When I finished, she set down her pen and looked at me for a moment. "You may be right," she said, "but being right and proving it are two different things. Suspicion won't protect you. Documentation will." It was the first sentence in months that made me feel less helpless. For the next several weeks, Laura worked through everything I could legally obtain. She compared the signature on the filed will to older documents tied to my grandfather's bank forms, tax records, a vehicle title, copies of checks, and even a few cards I still had stored in a box at home. She traced what happened to the estate accounts after my grandfather's death and followed the money outward through debts, transfers, and property-related payments connected to my parents. During that time, I tried to keep living normally, but normal no longer fit. I went to work, charted patients, made coffee runs at 3 a.m, drove home at sunrise, and checked my phone too often. Every day felt stretched thin with waiting. Then, almost 3 months after our first meeting, Laura called and asked me to come back to her office. I knew from her tone that something had solidified. When I arrived, there was a bound report sitting on her desk, thick enough to make my stomach tighten. Laura rested one hand on it before she spoke. "I'm going to be very plain," she said. "The signature on the will filed with probate does not match your grandfather's verified signatures." Even though I had expected it, hearing the words spoken aloud made the room seem to shift around me. She turned the report so I could see the comparison pages, letter formation, slant, pressure, spacing, the natural flow of a real signature versus one that had been imitated too carefully. My grandfather's genuine signature had movement in it, even in the later years when his hand had grown less steady. The one on the will looked stiff, almost drawn. Then she moved to the financial section, and that was worse. After probate closed, more than $400,000 had moved out of my grandfather's estate through a series of withdrawals and transfers Laura had mapped line by line. $130,000 had gone toward my father's personal debt and credit cards. $90,000 had paid off a truck loan and other liabilities in his name. $70,000 had been transferred into an account linked to my mother. $45,000 had gone to a contractor for work on my parents' house. The rest had been taken out in smaller cash withdrawals and fragmented transfers that looked random until you saw them all together on the page. Laura had put them all together. I sat there, staring at the numbers, feeling my body go very still. It wasn't grief. It wasn't recklessness. It was method. My father hadn't stumbled into control of the estate and made selfish choices afterward. He had positioned himself to take it. Laura let the silence sit between us for a moment before she asked, "Do you want me to formalize this?" I looked at the report again, then back at her. By then my hands were steady. "Yes," I said, "formalize it." And the moment I said it, I understood that whatever this had once been called inside my family, it was no longer a misunderstanding. It was evidence. The moment Laura formalized the report, something in my mind shifted. Up until then, I had been moving through fragments, suspicions, instincts, patterns that only lined up when I was alone with them long enough. But now I had something solid. Dates, signatures, transfers, conclusions, Another person was willing to put her name behind. And strangely, once I had that, the next place my mind went wasn't to a lawyer or a courtroom. It went to my grandfather's sister. Her name was Margaret Coleman, though most of the family called her Aunt Maggie, and for as long as I could remember, she had existed on the edges of family gatherings like someone everyone knew but no one fully welcomed. She lived alone about 40 minutes from my grandfather's town in an old one-story house with faded blue shutters and a narrow porch crowded with flower pots. I hadn't seen her in years. There had been some kind of falling out with my father a long time ago, one of those family breaks nobody explained clearly because silence was always easier than honesty. But after reading Laura's report, I kept thinking about something my grandfather used to say whenever her name came up: Maggie sees more than she says. At the time, I had taken it as one of those vague things older people say. Now it felt like a clue. I found her number in an old address book I had taken from my grandfather's house after the funeral and called her on a Thursday evening, half expecting the line to be disconnected. She answered on the third ring. Her voice sounded thinner than I remembered, but still sharp. I introduced myself, and there was a pause long enough to make me wonder if she was about to hang up. Then she said, very quietly, "I've been waiting for this call longer than you know." The words hit me so hard I had to sit down. She told me to come Saturday afternoon. When I pulled into her driveway 2 days later, the house looked almost exactly the way I remembered it from childhood. Sun-faded siding, lace curtains, a wind chime moving gently in the breeze. Aunt Maggie opened the door before I knocked. She was smaller than I remembered, her silver hair pinned back neatly, her face lined in a way that made her look both fragile and stern. She didn't hug me. She just studied me for a moment and stepped aside. Inside, the house smelled faintly of cedar and coffee. We sat at her kitchen table, and for a minute neither of us said anything. Then she stood, walked to a cabinet, and came back holding a large manila envelope with worn, softened corners. She set it between us without ceremony. "Your grandfather gave me this 3 years ago," she said. "He told me if anything ever felt wrong after he passed, you'd be the one to come looking." I opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a folded, handwritten document on yellowing paper. I knew what it was before I finished the first page. It was a will, dated 5 years before my grandfather died, witnessed and signed, and it did not leave everything to my father. It divided the estate equally among 4 grandchildren, exactly the kind of decision that sounded like him. My throat tightened as I kept reading. This was not vague. It was clear, deliberate, fair. I looked up at Aunt Maggie. "Why would he give this to you?" I asked. She lowered herself into the chair across from me and folded her hands. "Because he didn't trust Richard," she said. There was no hesitation in her voice at all. "Not near the end. He said your father had gotten too interested in what would happen after he died." The room seemed to go still around me. Aunt Maggie glanced toward the window, then back at me. "He also told me Richard kept feeding him stories about you," she said. "Said you were too busy for him now. Said you didn't want to come around. Said you had moved on and didn't care." For a second I couldn't speak. All I could hear was the blood rushing in my ears. The silence of those last 3 years, the unanswered calls, the cards that never came back, the ache I had carried without understanding it all shifted at once into something uglier and clearer. My father hadn't only taken money. He had taken time. He had stood between me and the man who had loved me most and let me believe that distance had been my grandfather's choice. Aunt Maggie watched my face and seemed to understand exactly what had landed. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, but I was already looking back down at the will in my hands, because in that moment it felt like more than paper. It felt like proof that my grandfather had tried, in the only way left to him, to leave the truth somewhere my father couldn't bury forever. I kept staring at the will in my hands long after Aunt Maggie stopped speaking, as if reading the same lines again might somehow make them hurt less. It didn't. If anything, the opposite happened. The longer I sat there, the clearer everything became. My father had not only maneuvered himself toward my grandfather's money, he had also poisoned the space between us while Grandpa was still alive, feeding him lies until silence replaced a relationship I had once trusted. Knowing that should have made the situation feel simpler, more defined. Instead, it left me feeling hollow in a way that was harder to explain. Evidence can give shape to the truth, but it doesn't soften it. When I finally left Aunt Maggie's house that afternoon, I drove home with the real Will on the passenger seat beside me and a kind of exhaustion that sat deeper than sleep. For the next 2 days, I went to work, charted patients, answered call lights, smiled when I had to, and moved through everything as if I were operating from a few inches outside my own body. Then, late on Tuesday night, my phone rang. It was Aaron. Aaron was my younger brother, the quiet one in the family, the one who had spent most of his life surviving by staying neutral. He lived closer to our parents than I did and had a habit of slipping in and out of family conflict without ever planting both feet on either side. He almost never called late, which was why I knew the moment I saw his name that something was wrong. When I answered, his voice was low and tight. "Are you alone?" he asked. I was standing in my kitchen, one hand still resting on the counter. "Yes." There was a pause long enough for me to hear him breathe. Then he said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you not to ask me why I waited." I sat down slowly at the kitchen table and stared at the dark window over the sink. "Okay." Another pause. "About 2 months ago, I stopped by Mom and Dad's to pick up my tool set from the garage," he said. "I came in through the side door, and they didn't hear me." My grip tightened around the phone. "They were in the kitchen," he continued, arguing. Dad was angry. Mom sounded scared. I only caught part of it at first, but once I realized they were talking about you, I pulled out my phone and hit record. For a second, I couldn't say anything at all. The house around me felt impossibly quiet. "Aaron," I said finally, and even to me my voice sounded strange, flatter than it should have. "What did you hear?" He let out a breath through his nose, the kind people make when they know they can't keep something inside any longer. "Dad said you couldn't prove anything," he said. "He said the will was already filed and done. Mom asked what would happen if you got a lawyer, and he said..." Aaron stopped. "What?" I asked. "He said if you pushed, they'd go louder. He said they'd make you look like the villain before you ever had the chance to tell your side. He said nobody was going to believe you over them." I closed my eyes. There it was, the rumors, the church whispers, the calls from relatives, the sudden story about missing cash. None of it had happened by accident. It had been planned. My father had not simply reacted to me. He had prepared for me. "Do you still have it?" I asked. Another pause. Then Aaron said, "Yes." The word landed with a force that made my chest tighten. "I almost sent it to you that night," he said quickly, the guilt in his voice impossible to miss now. "I should have. I know I should have. But they're still my parents, Emily." And I kept telling myself, maybe Dad was just talking. Maybe he wouldn't really do it. I looked down at the grain of the kitchen table and said quietly, "He did." Aaron went silent for a moment. "I know. Send it to me," I said. This time he didn't hesitate. My phone buzzed with the incoming file while we were still on the call. I opened it immediately. The audio was muffled, distorted by distance and walls, but the voices were unmistakable. My father came through first, sharp and impatient. "She can't prove anything. The will is filed. It's done." Then my mother, smaller and strained. "But what if she gets a lawyer?" A rustle, a pause. Then my father again, colder this time. Then we go louder. We make her the villain. "Nobody's going to believe her over us." The recording ended, and for a second all I could hear was the sound of my own breathing. It is one thing to suspect that people are trying to destroy your reputation. It is another thing entirely to hear your parents plan it in their own voices. "Why are you telling me now?" I asked softly. Aaron was quiet so long I thought maybe the call had dropped. Then he said, "Because silence stopped feeling neutral." I looked at the real will still lying on the counter, then at the audio file glowing on my phone screen, and something inside me settled into a calm I hadn't felt in months. The forged will, the money trail, the real will, and now this. For the first time, I didn't just have suspicion. I had proof that they had built the lie on purpose. For the first time, I didn't just have suspicion. I had proof that they had built the lie on purpose. And once I had that, Thanksgiving stopped feeling like a family dinner and started feeling like a stage my father had spent months preparing. By the time the holiday arrived, I already knew he was planning something. I could feel it in the way my mother's texts suddenly turned soft and pleading, full of words like healing and closure, as if what they wanted from me was peace and not silence. I could hear it in the clipped certainty of my father's voice when he called 2 nights before and told me, not asked me, that I would be there. He wasn't inviting me to dinner. He was summoning me to an audience, so I went. I drove to Aunt Linda's house with the real will, Laura's report, copies of the probate file, and Aaron's recording sealed inside a manila envelope in the passenger seat beside me. The whole drive there, my hands stayed steady on the wheel, but my mind kept returning to the same thought. If my father said nothing, I would say nothing. I was not going there to burn the family down. I was going there because after everything he had taken, I was done running from a version of me he had invented. Aunt Linda's house was already full when I arrived. Cars lined both sides of the driveway and spilled into the grass. Inside, the living room had been rearranged to fit 2 long folding tables pushed together end to end, covered in mismatched autumn tablecloths and crowded with casseroles, pies, and bowls of food going lukewarm beneath the noise of too many conversations. At least 30 relatives had come, more than usual, which told me my father had wanted witnesses. The room shifted the second I stepped in, not loudly, not openly, but enough that I felt it. Glances, pauses, a silence that moved through people before they picked their conversations back up again. My father was already seated near the head of the table in a pressed shirt and dark blazer, dressed more carefully than any man needed to be for Thanksgiving dinner. My mother sat beside him with a napkin folded neatly in her lap, her face already arranged into something fragile. I took my place halfway down the table and slipped my bag under my chair. The envelope rested against my ankle like a pulse. Dinner started the way these things always do, with forced normalcy. Someone carved the turkey, someone else complained about traffic. Glasses clinked. A football game played low from the next room. But I could feel my father waiting. 20 minutes into the meal, he tapped his fork against his water glass, and the room quieted in layers. Adults first, then the teenagers. Then even the children at the smaller table near the den fell silent. My father stood slowly and placed both hands on the table. "Before we go around and say what we're thankful for," he said, "there's something this family needs to address." My mother lowered her eyes. Her hand went to her napkin. The performance had begun. "Some of you have heard pieces of what's been happening," he continued, his voice grave and controlled. "I wish this could have remained private, but unfortunately our daughter has forced this family into a painful position." Then he turned toward me, and every face in the room turned with him. "Emily stole money from my father before he died," he said, "and we have proof." The room seemed to contract around those words. My aunt inhaled sharply. Someone at the far end whispered, "Oh my God." My mother's crying began right on cue, soft at first, then louder as my father reached into the inside pocket of his blazer and pulled out a white envelope. He walked the length of the table slowly, letting everyone watch him, and stopped beside my chair. "This," he said, placing it in front of me, "is a court summons." I looked down at it without touching it. From the edge of my vision, I could see relatives leaning forward, waiting for me to break. That was what he wanted: shock, tears, denial, some desperate reaction he could frame as guilt. Instead, I lifted my eyes to his face and asked very quietly, "Are you done?" He blinked, just once. It was the first crack I had seen in him all evening. Then I bent down, reached beneath my chair, and pulled my own manila envelope from my bag. I placed it on the table beside his white one and rested my hand on top of it. The room went still again, but this time, the silence felt different. He stared at the envelope, and for the first time that night, my father looked uncertain. "Good," I said, meeting his eyes, "because so do I."